Yeah, so I'm Luqman, and I'm the Oakland Program Manager for Capacity Building at the Greenlining Institute. The Greenlining Institute is a statewide policy and advocacy organization, a racial justice organization as well. And we are really our mission and like the future that we're trying to build towards is a future where communities of color can build wealth, live in places with economic opportunity, and are ready to meet the challenges posed by climate change. So our main focus areas of work are around like economic equity, climate equity, transformative communities like systems change, and also the local place-based work, which is where I sit. I think for reducing pollution, it's twofold. It's one, like regulating and having stronger enforcement on pollution sources, existing pollution sources, and then also like moving towards getting around in ways that are cleaner and greener and don't rely on fossil fuels, and also powering our lives in ways that are cleaner and greener. So I'm thinking about, primarily in neighborhoods and communities in West Oakland, Chinatown, East Oakland, like they're encircled by freeways that constantly have trucks and cars going at all hours, emitting diesel, and causing pollution that causes health impacts. And then also most of the industry in Oakland are in those neighborhoods. So how can we address land use policies to make sure that trucks aren't going alongside schools. Trucks are like maybe even moving towards being zero emission. How are we also supporting our transportation systems so that they're better connected, cheaper, so that we're not always driving? Lot of different strategies to address that. But I think twofold kind of big picture. It's about enforcement on existing pollution sources, both like trucks and cars, and then also working towards ways that we can get around that are cleaner and greener, and then the cost burden of electrifying doesn't fall on, low-income folks, doesn't fall on renters. I think it's about thinking about access, what that means. So when I think about access, one, I think about proximity, like, are you able to easily walk to a food hub? I also think about affordability, like it's not very meaningful if your nearby grocery store or food hub has pantries full of things that are out of your price range. And then lastly, I think about quality. So if everything in your neighborhood, grocery store, food hub is just like bottom of the barrel, moldy, that's not access either. So what are the ways that we can hit all those three things and then also support like community serving and maybe even community owned food hubs or ways of getting food to our communities? I'd be remiss to not talk about safe and sanitary homes without talking about the fact that you need to be housed in order to have a safe and sanitary home. So it's about addressing the housing crisis that's very real in Oakland. But then also thinking about like holistic building upgrades. So to me, that looks like equitable building decarbonization, which is like removing fossil fuels from our appliances and buildings, which have really terrible health impacts, in a way that the price and cost is not a burden on renters and low-income homeowners. But then also when you're doing those upgrades, addressing things like lead and mold in the home, doing weatherization and all other things that aren't necessarily related to, a gas stove, but can improve the safety and health of the home. I know I've broken apart access a bunch of different times. When I'm thinking about access to healthy green spaces, I'm also thinking about proximity, but I'm also thinking about quality. I think in Oakland, there are some neighbors that truly don't have a nearby park or green space, but then there are other neighborhoods where, yes, you have a park, but it's not well maintained, it's not really usable. So just, I guess, working from the framework of every Oaklander should be within, for example, a half mile of a green space that's usable, that's, attractive to the community, and then working backwards to figure out how to address that. I'd also love to see the ways that we can provide more access to like our shoreline. I'm thinking about Middle Harbor, for example. I've lived in Oakland my whole life, and I only went there for the first time last year, and only because I had access to a car. And I'm also thinking about the MLK shoreline, like what are ways we can improve mobility to have access to the beautiful bodies of water that surround us. I think there are a lot of strategies to help us prevent those hazards, but also kind of weather and bounce back from those hazards. But the one that really comes to mind are resilience hubs, which are basically spaces that are already in community. Think of like libraries, community centers, rec centers that communities go to already to gather, be in space with neighbors, or get services and information in the everyday, and how those spaces can be provided with resources and tools to weather emergencies and for people to go when there's a fire, for example. So that could look like solar panels, that could look like backup power. And I think that's really important to have. I'll also say that resilience is having just strong and healthy communities. So investing in stronger like social and economic supports also helps with resilience. Yeah, kind of like you're saying, the safety element is super important because it's a way for us to kind of inform the guidelines or like the plans for how to address all these hazards. So how to address earthquakes when they happen, how to address flooding when that happens. It's really top of mind for me, as in the past month, we've had extreme rains, flooding. And so this is an opportunity for us to know, right, the climate crisis is now, and what are ways that we can prepare, what are ways that we can resource things that communities are already doing in the form of more mutual aid, so that when these things happen, unfortunately, we're able to withstand it and then bounce back better. Yeah, so I think it's, first sitting with the hard realization that the climate crisis is happening now, and then planning for that in a community-informed way. Thinking about things like sea level rise and flooding. There's a lot of like nature-based solutions that we can have to kind of mitigate the effects of flooding. There's also things that we need to think about in our planning and putting people first. So understanding that, right, there are a lot of toxic sites, and when there's flooding, that's going to get into our water supply, that's going to cause health hazards. So that how can we plan now, thinking about people and communities that are in these flood zones and the potential impacts of that, working backwards. What do we need to do now to address those things? I think it's just starting to have that conversation, starting to, I know it can maybe feel like some things are further away and there are more pressing issues, but maybe the city and community are meeting about some other initiative. It's bringing the conversations about planning for floods or just planning for ways that neighbors and neighborhoods can be supported in times of community right now, and having those conversations early so it's not reactive, and figuring out ways to have a more ongoing partnership and meaningful communication between community residents and the city. Because I think we each hold different, skill sets, different resources, different parts of the equation. And it's about kind of setting the groundwork now while we still have the time in some sense, rather than just responding in a time of emergency. Which I will say, usually when you don't kind of have those initial plans, especially grounded in equity, you're going to fall back on inequitable practices. And so the response is not going to be a good response. Yeah, I would just encourage residents to get involved where they can. Maybe there's going to be, a pop-up event nearby where you can, join in to learn about what's going on and express kind of your needs, your priorities, or just reach out by saying, something as simple as being like, hey, this is an issue that I always have to transfer 3 buses to get to downtown, and I have to wait a really long time each one. Like, that's an issue, and that's like lived experience and lived knowledge that should be uplifted and the city should address. I think sometimes in plans and policy spaces, there's a little bit of like, oh, I didn't go to policy school, or I don't have the language that you're using, but just lived experiences, lived knowledge by being an Oaklander is truly like, that's the gold, and that's what we should be planning around. So anything that you have to offer in terms of a need, a priority, to please voice that. I'll also offer myself. I will be reading the environmental justice element, and I'm happy to talk through it with anyone if they'd like.